So, Tim, you're quite a unique voice in such that you are a longtime insider of the Silicon Valley community, but at the same time maintained enough distance to still sort of make sense of it all, remain an outside observer, and not shy away from being critical of some of the big tech developments or some like fights. For example, with Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, right, and pushed back on his philosophy of blitzscaling. So these days, what's your biggest criticism of Silicon Valley and its place of the world?
Well, it's actually probably my biggest criticism at the moment, and the area that I'm focused on is that Silicon Valley has squandered the opportunity that I once called Web 2.0, which was this idea of harnessing collective intelligence. If you look back at Google and Amazon, in their early years, what they were doing was using all of the signal from millions, hundreds of millions of people on the web to decide what people really needed to see. So Google, their idea was to come up with what the world collectively thought was the best result. Amazon, they took all kinds of signals and tried to figure out what was the best result, when you searched on Amazon. And that was actually their distinguishing feature. Now you fast forward 20 years, and what do they show you? They show you their own products, and they show you things that their advertisers paid them to put in front of you. And I don't think that our antitrust regulators and the like have really come to grips with that. I'm working now on a project with Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, on what we're calling algorithmic rents, which is this idea that these are basically these vast marketplace systems, and the companies that control the algorithm are able to allocate excess value to themselves rather than to the marketplace participants. And the project we're working on is really to trace changes in the designs and the algorithms at Google and Amazon and other companies over time, and show how this is reflected in their financial results versus the results of the people who are part of their information ecosystem.
And how have you seen, sort of, especially now in the pandemic, where a lot of small businesses obviously have really struggled and are still struggling, and tech giants and tech companies actually benefiting from it? How have you sort of seen this development going forward? Like, is big tech, in your view, the big winner of this crisis?
I don't think that anyone is a big winner in a time of crisis like this, at least a big long-term winner. It's accelerated the returns to bigness. And there's a wonderful book by Tim Wu, which is, the title comes from a quote from Justice Louis Brandeis, which is "The Curse of Bigness." And the curse of bigness is something that has really afflicted our society. We may, and this really comes back to, in some sense, my deep criticism of tech, which has led me to a general economic critique, which is, in some sense, I look at the parallels between, how machine learning works with various kinds of optimization functions. And then I look at our society and say, oh, we're running on an optimization function too. In some ways, the whole narrative about rogue AI is the idea that we give it a command, and then it just goes and executes that command, that optimization function, regardless of the consequences. That's the famous Nick Bostrom paperclip maximizer. But I look at the behavior of someone like Facebook. They basically were saying to themselves, well, if we show people more engaging content, it will further our mission of bringing people together. They've found that they're wrong, and we now expect them to change the algorithm. Now, there's two interesting pivot points in what's happened with Facebook. The first is, why is it so hard for them to change the algorithm? I think the biggest reason is that they have a constraint which is set from outside them, which is the constraint that, well, whatever changes you make, you can't lose too much money doing it. Because the master algorithm of our economy is that a company, particularly a public company, must keep growing, must keep increasing its earnings. And this is where I look at that and I say, oh, our economy is like that rogue AI that Nick Bostrom talked about, where we said, you must keep growing. And it really came into play, I think, particularly in the US in the 1980s with the rise of this idea that we now call shareholder value thinking. You know, the only, you know, it started from this essay by Milton Friedman, the only, you know, obligation of a company is to increase its profits, because of course it will then pass them through to individuals. But it turned out not to be the case. And you look at executive compensation as part of that problem. Tax avoidance is part of that problem. Companies, you know, like if you look at pharma actually doing things that are harmful to their customers, or, you know, oil companies continuing to double down on you know, pushing, you know, dangerous energy practices. You know, all of these are the result of an algorithm which we actually set into tax policy, into jurisprudence. And it's, you know, and the analogies between things like tax policy and jurisprudence to a Facebook or a Google algorithm are something that I keep trying to explicate. But you really look at that and you go, wow, we are actually telling our economy to produce these bad effects. And we don't have to do that.
Don't you think that pointing to the economic circumstances and this deep systemic flaw, right, sort of this optimization algorithm that has shaped our society, kind of strips the tech companies of responsibility? I mean, is that sort of an excuse to say, you know, they're basically victims of the system, they didn't have another choice?
No, we always have a choice. And I do think that greater awareness of the choices that we're making makes it possible to make a different one. But I do think, I guess I do think in some ways that tech is the whipping boy, you know, and yes, it does absolve them of responsibility, but I would also say that making tech the bad guy absolves the rest of society of responsibility. And I think we actually need to come to some different realizations about what we actually value in our society. And you see this in some ways, the difference between the US and Europe, you know, where Europe actually, you know, is expressing different values in some of the choices that it makes. And the dominant economic orthodoxy says, well, yeah, Europe's not as competitive. And I go, yeah, but they're focused on quality of life for their citizens. And maybe the rest of the world should be too. You know, it's much more sustainable. And I think we're at a pivot point in the economy. Now, and there's really two ways that we're going to get to what I call the next economy. And one of them, and the most likely one, is through disaster and crisis. That's really how history generally happens. You know, things happen because they're forced to happen. And you know, the climate crisis in particular, you know, COVID as sort of a sub-crisis, are driving enormous changes. You know, and they're also moving the Overton window of what's possible. You know, who would have thought that, you know, we could close all these offices and people all work from home? And who would think that we could decarbonize? You know, there's this idea from Aristotle of what virtue is. And the idea of virtue was the control of the appetites by reason. And my brother James once very cleverly said, oh, so what he's saying is virtue is remembering what you really want. You know, and like, do we really want unlimited growth? Do we, you know, we really want a good life, and we want a good life for everyone. So we have to actually impose some limits on ourselves, and we have to do an inquiry into what is keeping us from making those good choices.
And you just walked us through an array of great ideas, right? I mean, platform co-ops, access to community, B Corps, LTSE. There's so many good ideas on the table. And it just kind of begs the question, you know, do you think it will require kind of a bottom-up convergence? It's just like at some point we'll reach critical mass and there's just enough change makers and good ideas out there so that a broader reset will occur? Or does it require some kind of governmental or transnational coordination? And maybe adding to that, I want to go back to tech, because you said, well, there's a risk that they're the whipping boy, but of course they can also be the beacon, right? They can also do
that's right.
Not just material actions, but but symbolic actions, right? That would probably then usher in change at a much broader level. So curious to hear, like, how do we make that massive change happen at a real
You know, it's a really good question. And I've been influenced lately by Ada Palmer. She's a science fiction writer, but by night, but by day, she's a professor of Renaissance history at University of Chicago. And she blogs on a site called Ex Urbe. And she has these wonderful perspectives on how history actually happens. And the combination of great forces and and recurring patterns, but also of individual choices. And I think that's how it works. You know, it's all of the above. You know, there are factors that are driving us. You know, like climate change, for example, like the great power. You know, again, we're kind of at this place where there's a power shift between the U.S. and China that's deeply shaping what's happening in the economy. There's a whole lot of big factors, but there are also individual choices. And you see that, for example, the choice that we're facing in U.S. politics right now between, Trump and Biden, in ordinary times, this would not be quite so significant. But this is a pivot around climate change. It's a pivot around international relations. And, the individual choice and the individual actions make a huge difference. And our own choices will make a huge difference. But I think there is a way that the collective. I've always been a huge fan of changes in the collective intelligence. When I first wrote my book, I remember talking with Kara Swisher, and she kept saying, "Who is this we you talk about? Like we're all helpless in the face of." These great powers around us. I told her, I reminded Kara of the story of the American Revolution and how when George Washington decided that he would go back to his farm after, winning the victory, that King George is reputed to have said, if he has done that, he is the greatest man in the world, because they expected George Washington to be crowned king in America. But Americans believed something different, and we built something different as a result. And I think about that today, the belief, after World War II, that we should uplift everybody made a huge difference. The belief starting in the 1980s that we should make our businesses more efficient above all else and drive shareholder value above all else made a difference. And so when we collectively believe something different, when we collectively subscribe to donut economics, for example, we will suddenly start to act differently. And so there is this massive shift of belief. And let me kind of come back to Ada Palmer and this fascinating story that she raised. She contrasted Savonarola and Martin Luther. Now, apart from the fact that Savonarola seems to me, at least, to have been much more of a savage, but she said, like, both of them were church reformers. Both of them were in the age of the printing press, and they spread their ideas through pamphlets. But Savonarola ended up burned at the stake, and Luther ended up igniting wars that lasted 100 years across Europe. And she said, what was the difference? The difference was between, in those intervening 30 years, printing had gotten increased distribution. It was like once they figured out to locate, for example, printing presses in Venice, then things could be printed and distributed all over Europe on ships and things like that. So ideas getting out more widely. And I think about that in the present. We're in one of those moments where we have very different kinds of distribution of ideas and content than we did 30 years ago. And so it's going to be very interesting. The downside of that is that she says, look, every time there's a revolution in the sharing of information, there has been warfare. And I hope we don't go that way, but we might.
On the idea of collective intelligence and this distribution of information. We recently talked to Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan, who's also going to be speaking. And she's much, this proclaimer, obviously, of the Gov0 initiative, so community focused on tools and developing tools for civil participation and this more open source way of governing. So what is your take on that? And do you think that this type of governance can help with making change on a larger scale?
Yes, there's no question that the new kinds of governance are possible. I think that we are entering a period where some country is going to figure out how to do it better, and will literally outcompete as a result. And I think that this the ability, and again, we see signs of it. It's not just the things that they're done with in Taiwan, but you look at like the bottom-up response to the coronavirus in Hong Kong, or you look at which really wasn't coordinated by the government. It was actually coordinated by the resistance, because they had tools of collective action, and they were able to say, hey, this is how we need to respond to this totally different crisis. You also see it in experiments in some European countries, where you actually are, like the Irish referendum, that was really done in this very consultative way, with people. And there's a kind of deliberative democracy that is starting to take hold in certain places, where people aren't just sort of, kind of the puppets of media manipulation, but are asked to engage more deeply and to craft ideas that really are representative. And obviously that's really what Audrey has really been, presiding over in Taiwan, in their case, doing it through digital means. But I think we're entering a period of experimentation, and again, but kind of going back to history, you have to say that a lot of those experiments, you look back and you'll say, wow, that was the shape of the future, but it didn't actually take hold till 100 years later. It's not like it necessarily, you kind of can elide an awful lot of history looking backwards.
The question, though, is regardless of the outcome, perhaps, how America can heal and can recover from 4 years of Trump. And reading articles recently, I think there's one camp saying America's strong. There is really strong common ground. There's research also indicating that there is actually great values alignment, and there can be sort of a new we, a larger us, if you will. But there's also articles. I was just reading one in the New Yorker by Robin Wright saying America's a myth. So aside from the American exceptionalism, there isn't actually a lot of common ground, and America has always been divided into at least two factions that really have a lot in common. So I'm just curious to hear, do you think America is going to come together again and can heal the divide, or is it just set up ultimately for breaking apart, for secession?
If I had to play the odds, I would say that it's more likely that we do not heal enough than that we do. That being said, I'm always an optimist, and I do have hope that we can, renew ourselves. But quite frankly, my overall expectation for the next 100 years is it's going to be a pretty crappy 100 years. And that, and really what we're fighting for is the shape of the future after that.
So what would be then your advice to future generations and, millennials like myself, but younger people? What are the qualities that you would be looking for in future leaders?
Well, I think, keep your idealism, work to keep it. The advice I give all the time is work on stuff that matters. Make those choices to build the world that you want to live in and that you want your kids to live in. And there are a lot of people who do that. You know, you look at all the struggle for a better future on so many fronts by so many people. And I would just say, don't give up hope. You know, and it's that wonderful quote from Rilke. And this is actually a translation of a translation rather than, you know, the original German. But I figure if since somebody can translate it, I can expand on it further. It's this poem called The Man Watching. And it's the end is a story about Jacob wrestling with the angel in the Old Testament. You know, he says the wrestlers of the Old Testament, you know, they didn't think they could win when they wrestled with the angel. And then he goes on, he says, what we fight with is so small. And when we win, it makes us small. What we want is to be defeated decisively by successively greater beings. And I just love that. You know, it's like, yeah, fight like hell, even if you can't win. You know, if you don't think you can win, because you get stronger from the fight.
Maybe last question for you, Tim. I mean, it's just remarkable listening to you, because there is just no ounce of cynicism. And you've been, you know, part of Silicon Valley for, you know, a while. You've been observing it, critiquing it. You've seen many promises made and broken, moments of disenchantment, frustration, and recovery. But you haven't turned cynical. At least it's not visible, or, you know, you can't find that in your writing. So how do you do that? How do you maintain, you know, that overall optimistic outlook and not become cynical?
Well, I believe that people are fundamentally good and they fundamentally want to do the right thing. And that, you know, we have to basically create the conditions where that becomes easier for them, for us. You know, again, it's a continuum from your, you know, personal culture through, you know, through global economics. You know, you think about, for example, how fitness became something in, you know, in modern rich societies. You know, it's like people used to smoke, they, you know, routinely overate, and they still do in you know, many, you know, parts of our cultures. But you know, this new idea took hold that no, you should take care of yourself in a different way. And so here's this sort of totally self-motivated you know, sea change, and then it gets fed because an industry grows up to support it. You know, and so there's this really interesting interaction between a new idea, and then it creates economic opportunity, and then the system starts to pivot towards it. You know, so, you know, fitness became a growth industry, you know, and you think about all of the, you know, challenged by COVID, of course, but, you know, gyms and yoga studios and, you know, dietary options. And so you think in a similar way with, you know, with climate. You know, Elon Musk, you know, starts out with this sort of quixotic thing, you know, and you know, with Tesla, kind of shows that it's something can be done, that it can be successful. And now everybody's doing electric cars. And I think there'll be this similar pivot. As we think about the climate challenge, you know, they're going to start to be these, you know, there'll be more and more climate billionaires, and people will go, oh, well, that's where we go. You know, there's people who are doing things with vertical farming that are much more resource, you know, efficient. Oh, that's where we go. Oh, you know, these new kinds of technological opportunities that, you know, create market pressure. And so things, I like to use this great quote from Ernest Hemingway. It's in The Sun Also Rises, where he's talking with a friend of his in a bar in Pamplona, or I think it's in Pamplona. And he says, Mike, how did you go bankrupt? And Mike says, 2 ways. First, gradually, then suddenly. And of course, that's true both if you look at climate change, it's a gradually, then suddenly problem. But positive changes are also gradual, then sudden. You think about the way the internet, you know, was, you know, when I first started evangelizing the internet and the web in the early 90s, you know, it was like, what? You know, we had to do in 94, we did the first ever market research study of the economic potential of the internet. You know, we phoned up 50,000 people and said, you know, do you think you would buy things? And, you know, we had all these questions, and, you know, it was huffing and puffing, trying to get people excited about it. You know, I went around and lobbied phone companies about, you guys should be offering the internet as part of your service. And they weren't getting it, and then they get it, you know, because it starts to tilt, you know, and you have a couple of big wins and everybody goes, wow, they get stars in their eyes. And I think, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, the market economy will get harnessed towards solving some of these problems.